Today, we are excited to dive into the world of archaeological studies and understand how technology is reshaping our understanding of the past. To start, could you start by telling us about yourself?
Well, I also want to say that I didn't create the model by myself. I created it with two other amazing archaeologists, which are Robert Bishop and Claudine Gravel Miguel. And it's like a long-term project. I have actually just finished my PhD in the University of Zurich in Switzerland. And yeah, before that, I did a master's degree at Cambridge where I looked at the impact of socioeconomic changes on patterns of linguistic diversity. And now for my PhD, I worked on the impact of environmental changes over human evolution on the distribution of cultural and genetic diversity in Africa mostly.
Thank you. Let's begin with why this model was created. What's the main goal behind developing this model, and how does it help, in understanding prehistoric social networks?
So the purpose of the model is actually quite. It was an interesting beginning because, as I said, I'm really interested on how social dynamics have an impact on cultural evolution, right? And I've worked a lot on technology and on material culture. And one of the questions that we had is that, I've worked for the greatest part, or at least before my PhD, on contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. And obviously, contemporary hunter-gatherer societies are not a reflection in the past. So a big question on people that are working on looking at these dynamics in modern people is whether similar relationships between social and cultural dynamics were taking place in the past. And obviously, the way in which we can make inferences about those social processes in the past is through archaeology. But unlike in contemporary people, where we can look at social dynamics and material culture separately, when we look at archaeological assemblages, we kind of have both of them blended in one. So the question that we had is how, like, can methods of utilizing these material cultural assemblages tell us something about the social dynamics in the past, but also how how aspects of different settings, like, I don't know, different features of the environment or different objects that we use to investigate the archaeological record, or even things like the methods that we use to make inferences about social processes affect our ability to make those inferences, our ability to recover the social dynamics from the archaeology.
Every innovative project has its set of challenges. So, what were some significant challenges you encountered while developing this model, and how did you tackle them?
So, the main challenge, I think, for the model is that it ended up being quite a complicated model because the way in which we went about it was that we wanted to simulate social processes, then cultural acquisition and transmission processes in the past, and then actually the formation of the archaeological record to then, fast forward many time steps, take that archaeological record, and because we had recorded the social interactions in the past, see how they matched. And it turns out it's really not trivial to decide things like, how do we represent culture computationally? How do we represent patterns of transmission and innovation? How do we represent this process of cultural change? But also since we had all these parameters related to the environment, to social learning, to transmission, how do we actually give numerical values to these things in a way that it's meaningful but also representative of reality? And how we went about it, I guess, was testing a lot of what had been done before and how it functioned within this complex system, and also performing like really thorough sensitivity analysis. So we did many parameter sweeps to really fine-tune those dynamics in ways that were realistic. And actually, because our main goal of the model beyond our own research was to create a tool that other people could use for their own research and to tweak to specific settings. We published a paper last year just describing the model and describing the parameters that we had tried and kind of giving guidance on how it should be used so that it produces realistic dynamics.
Moving on the on the model's outcomes. From the simulations and data generated by this model, I mean, what are some key insights or patterns that have emerged from this?
And for me, actually, one of the main insights of the model was that actually we're looking at how different mobility regimes that we observe among contemporary hunter-gatherer people, but also that we thought to have represented ancient hunter-gatherer people, the huge impact that these different mobility regimes had on the actual structure of the archaeological record. So on how different the material cultural assemblages that we recovered from each camp were, or on how much of a big impact the size of hunter-gatherer camps in the past had for like how this cultural diversity was structured in the landscape. And for example, we were also surprised that other things, such as including crazy rates of environmental change, actually didn't alter that much the overall structure of the archaeological record. So I think for me, those were like important insights. But again, for example, my colleague Robert, who also has worked on this model from the beginning, he is really interested in things like things that affect the cultural traits themselves, because he's actually an archaeologist and he has worked on making social networks in the past with points, but also with ceramic wares. And we were also testing how different features of these cultural traits, like how visible or how easy they were to learn, whether they were useful in environmentally dependent things. So thinking about a tool that is useful to extract resources in a particular environment. So how these cultural trait specific features also had a huge impact in the kind of networks or in the kind of landscapes that we could build from the archaeological record.
Interesting. So, as you know, collaboration and sharing knowledge are very important in research. So, after developing this model, I mean, what steps did you take to make it accessible to other researchers or the public? I mean, in terms of archiving this model on the ComSys website, and in this process, did you face any special challenges, in fact, in the process?
I mean, I think it is always, or at least given how we tend to work on these kinds of things, like the moment where we decided to take a step to upload it to ComSys and to get it peer reviewed, it really forced us to have to think about the logics of the model. So I think, for example, making or writing the ODD for the model was like a just time intensive work, because we really had to make explicit every single decision that we had put in over the course of years, and the reasoning behind those decisions, as well as how they affected the model, and obviously making the code very, very clean, which is always also like a bit of a challenge, because we were 3 people developing the model in our own time, so we didn't necessarily have a standardized nomenclature throughout and these kinds of stuff. And obviously, to make it public, we just had to make sure that this was the case.
Thinking about what's next, what are the next steps for this model, and are there any new features or studies planned?
So at the moment, as I explained before, sort of the first thing we did was to look at how different parameters, so how different or factors related to the environment, to traits, or to social dynamics affect the structure of the archaeological record. And now what we're doing, actually, we're looking at, there's this new, or not new, but like there's this sort of rising trend in archaeology of using methods from social network analysis and graph theory to build networks from archaeological assemblages and analyze them as if they were the social networks that created them. So we are now doing some research really focusing on really whether these networks built from artifact similarities essentially are representative of the social networks that created them in the past. And again, how different social or environmental factors affect this match between the social and the archaeological networks. But also, Robert, for example, especially, but in general, we are doing a lot of work on looking at specifically, since we have both processes separately, looking at what are the best methods that we can use to build these networks. What metrics do hold or do not hold, what metrics are more vulnerable to some of the features of the archaeological record, like the fact that it's incomplete, the fact that it operates in different temporal and spatial scales than the social networks and all this stuff. And I guess for this, we've had to introduce a couple of features that make this job easier, so that the already output the assemblages in the form of adjacency matrices that represent the similarities between the assemblages of different camps or of different bands, or like some out of the box comparisons that we've been creating for these kinds of things with some of the extensions that NetLogo, which is the software that our model uses, already has built in, and some of these things.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing your insights and the exciting work you are doing with this model.
Thank you for taking the time.
No problem. You have a great day.
You too, have a nice sleep.